Money is more effective on the right than it is on the left.
I think there should be a cap on political donations.
Reform's concentration of funding is really extreme.
How do we protect what it is that we value? And if we value our elections... Hello and welcome to Electoral Dysfunction with me, Ruth Davidson.
And me, Harriet Harman.
And we are still in the midst of summer recess, so we are once again taking this opportunity to do something just a little bit different for today's episode. We want to pick up on one of the biggest topics that's been rumbling on over the past year.
You know, I think what he wants to do, really, is to try and help us get onto a level playing field with the trade union-funded Labour Party and a Conservative Party where there seems to be a remarkable correlation, I can't think why, between donations and membership of the House of Lords.
You find yourself caught in a row over the huge amount of freebies you've accepted while Leader of the Opposition, £107,000, far more than any other MP. Do you acknowledge that this has undermined your message and reputation, and are you sorry about that?
Well, I think it's important just to put it in its context. Any gift or donation to a politician has to be declared. Everything I've had has been declared. And sitting behind the numbers are some human explanations.
We follow all the rules, the regulations. We believe in that transparency. When the time is right, we will declare any donations that we've received recently.
This is Nigel Farage making the argument that he wants the people of Clacton to judge him after he has had a number of questions around donations he has taken.
Yes, it's all about the money, the wonga, the moolah, the donations, the gifts, the whatever you want to call it. Today we're going to do a bit of a deep dive into where political parties get their money from, how that affects all of us due to influence of money on policy, and we'll ask whether the rules need a bit of an update.
And we'll be looking at how the changes that have been happening have changed the landscape here on money and politics. What's the influence of tech with bots and with cryptocurrency? So we'll be speaking to Peter Geoghegan, investigative journalist and author of Democracy for Sale, Dark Money and Dirty Politics.
But before we bring you the chaps, Harriet, you are just the bastion of integrity and font of all knowledge on this programme, to the point where I think regular listeners will have heard that you once remortgaged your own house rather than take donations to run to be deputy leader of the Labour Party. You were also the mother of the house, so you were the longest serving MP for a period of time. So you've seen the great swathes of how politics has changed in this country. And I'm kind of interested to hear how much of an issue you think this is right now and how much of a changing issue you think it is.
Well, I think it's all about trust in politics. And people are entitled to have a politics, a government, a democracy that they can believe in and that they can believe that they run as the voters and that they believe is fair. I've been involved in these issues for a long time because of being in Parliament for a long time and also having chaired the Standards and Privileges Committee, which is about the rules, which include rules about money in the House of Commons. But actually, I remortgaged my house to finance my campaign in the election to be deputy leader of the Labour Party, not because I thought it was a cleaner way of funding my election campaign, but because I didn't seem to be able to raise any donations because I was the absolute outsider and everybody thought I was going to lose. So, yes, I did have to remortgage my house, but actually I did win after all.
Do you know,
I wouldn't say I was a bastion of integrity. I would say I was like chief nerd of looking at all these rules because I believe they're not just technical, they're really important for our democracy.
The nerds always triumph because it's always when it comes to Parliament and it comes to politics, it's the people who understand what it is that you can do within the rules that end up all these sort of swaggering kind of braggadocio types that just think that they can go and do and say what they like. It's the nerds that catch them out every single time. But I've talked before on this pod about how being a politician is like not one job. When you're a deputy leader like you or the leader of a party in Scotland or Wales or Northern Ireland or for the UK, like fundraising is part of it. And you're never that good at all the bits of the job. So there's bits of it you're better at than others and bits of it that frankly, you could see far enough. And I hated fundraising. Like I absolutely hated it. I hated going into a room of very rich usually men, and having to ask them to give me stuff so I could do things. And even though I wasn't asking them to give it to me, I was asking them to give it to the party so the party could do things. Like, there's just that Presbyterian Scot inside of me. I absolutely hated it. But I have to say, I don't think I'm alone in that. I think there's lots of people that struggle with that in politics. And I have seen it made flesh, because I have seen, I think, possibly the worst person I've ever seen do this, which was Theresa May. And quite often, just to sort of get the kind of donations and stuff in, you'll have like a small private dinner where you've got, I don't know, 12 or 15 people around the table, and they give a check for their seat at the table, and they can speak to the Prime Minister or the Leader of the Opposition or the Cabinet Minister or whatever. And they expect from that dinner to have, a bit of flash of ankle of what we're going to do next, or how we're going to take on the other guys, or what the plans are for the election. And they feel like they're getting a view behind the curtain. And I have literally seen Theresa May sit at one of these dinners that I was at, and she can't do small talk. And she doesn't, it's like she can't play the game. Like, she physically can't, with people that she doesn't know and all the rest of it. She can't do the bonhomie. She can't do the, and let me tell you how we're going to take on Labour and blah, blah, blah. Like, she can't do it. She literally can't do it. And I think every single person left that dinner knowing less about Conservative plans for the future than more. I have a lot of love for Theresa May, and I think that history is going to be kind to her, because she's clearly a really principled woman that worked hard. But my God, that was not a skill in her wheelhouse.
Well, money in politics is a very vexed issue, and obviously for Theresa May, but more generally as well. But I think if you step back, it's that our political system is based on political parties. And to run a political party costs money. You've got to build your membership. You've got to engage with your membership. You've got to campaign in elections. You've got to campaign between elections. You've got to have finance to develop your policies, and all that costs money. And for the most part, in this country, that has been done by private money, not by state. In some countries, actually, public money pays for parties, but here we've said no party should be independent of public funding, and actually they should raise their money themselves. And therefore the question is how they can raise money, which is not dirty money, not corrupt money, not secret money, not too much money. They can actually raise money in a way which enables them to do their important job in our democracy, but doesn't become a reason for that trust and confidence in our democracy to be undermined. So that's why, and also there's a lot of rules about this. Mostly party fundraising is done by volunteers. Most party members are just ordinary people at local party level. You've got a treasurer who's trying to raise money. And there's all these rules about stopping money laundering and cryptocurrency and transparency. And actually what you've got is somebody who's a volunteer, who's not a qualified accountant, trying to get money in. So you've got to distinguish between, the bad guys who are trying to undermine the system and people who might make mistakes at local level.
If we're just talking about the money here, the sort of size of it, just as a kind of rule of thumb for people, if you think in an election campaign, how much stuff comes through your door and how many leaflets come through your door, even still, the current cost of a first-class stamp in the United Kingdom is £1.80. And the average size of a constituency is just over 73,000. So although you do deals with the Royal Mail, so they'll deliver stuff like unstamped, but if you're still thinking of, how much it costs even for postage per piece of literature that comes through the door, it runs into the tens and then hundreds of thousands and then into the millions on a national scale really, really quickly. And it adds up. The money we're talking about here for a general election campaign is enormous, isn't it, Harriet?
It is. And also there's paying for Facebook ads and things like that. But I think people have seen how much money is poured into politics in America, and this sense that the more big money comes in, especially as if it's from, crypto billionaires or tech behemoths, the more that money comes in by hugely wealthy individuals, the more it undermines the power of the ordinary person at the ballot box. And the other thing is that nobody really wants to see a situation where it's a fight between the parties. If it's the rules that are going to apply to all parties, then really all parties need to agree them. And it should be collaboration, it should be consensus, it shouldn't be partisan. And therefore it's something where everybody's got to get round the table. It can't be just the government saying, I'm going to decide these are the rules, because then everybody will say, well, actually, you've decided rules that suit your own party. There's got to be a consensus built on that.
Well, look, how clean our politics is affects absolutely everybody in the country. So as always, we'd love to hear from you. We'd love to know what you think. You can send us your thoughts via the burner phone. That's 07934 200 444. Or if you're an insider, you have access to the members forum, which will be linked to your show description.
And if you're not yet an insider, but would like access to ad-free listening, a bonus episode every single week, and more, you can find details of how to subscribe in the description. We would absolutely love to have you in the club.
Right, let's get to it. We're joined now by the investigative journalist Peter Geoghegan, who quite literally wrote the book on this back in 2020 when he published Democracy for Sale, Dark Money and Dirty Politics. Welcome to the pod, Peter.
Thank you very much for having me, Ruth. I'm delighted to be here.
Well, we want to start with you. We're gonna press you. We're gonna squeeze you like a citrus fruit for every drip of knowledge you can give us. But we're gonna start with a little bit of an introduction to the topic, because there's probably a few people listening who've actually never really thought about how politics in this country is funded and how campaigns work and how policy kind of provision and introduction happens. So can you just give us just a little bit of an explainer about sort of how it basically works in this country right now?
So effectively, British politics we run on private money, and I mean that in the widest sense. So political parties rely predominantly on donations to run themselves. The more successful parties, they do get some sort of subvention, what's called short money and other types of money that come from the public purse to run offices and things like that. So if you become an MP, if you become an MSP, as you were, Ruth, you will get a subvention to run your office. But in broadly speaking, our politics runs on private money. Most of that money, historically, you would have seen money, it was basically split in a two-party system, Conservatives, Labour. Labour predominantly reliant on money from the unions, the Conservatives predominantly money on private capital, effectively, captains of industry, etc. Increasingly, actually, parties are really reliant on money from private individuals. The amount of union funding has gone down, and effectively our politics increasingly based on donations, and increasingly larger donations. That's been the one big trend. In the last 20 years, the amount of money in our politics has gone up a lot. 2025 general election was about £50 million. Last general election, 2024, about £123 million. Even allowing for inflation, that's a big increase. But also we're seeing people giving bigger amounts of money. When I first started doing work in this area about 10 years ago, £50,000 would have been a big donation. You could become a member of, say, the Conservative Leaders Group, or if you gave £50,000, you're a big donor. Now it's 1 million, 2 million, 5 million. We've even seen £10 million donations.
That escalation of money, I mean, does that erode public trust? And is it kind of equal? Are all the parties at it, or is it one party or another?
Well, so there's a couple of things going on. And the first question in terms of is one party after other, what effectively happens in politics is an arms race. Once one party starts raising large amounts of money, other parties start to kind of, to move in sync. One of the things that we've done, the last Conservative government did, was really increase the spending limits at election time, which sounds a bit geeky, but they really matter, because parties have to be able, you have to be able to spend the money. And what we do in Britain at our politics is, and people find this surprising, if on a standard election cycle with 5 years, for 4 of those years there are no spending limits and there's no declarations of spending. It's only in a general election year that there's spending limits, and it's only in a general election year that we declare our spending. So there's a ceiling at how much you can spend during a general election, but that's gone up a lot. So that's kind of increased the amount of kind of supply, or the desire to supply money. And the other thing that's happened as well is, because we're seeing the rise of these, what you might call super donors or mega donors. So I think it's in 2023, about 2/3 of all the money raised, private donations in the UK, came from just 19 people. 19 very wealthy people. So we're seeing a real concentration of wealth that's happening in our politics. So that's what I mean about an arms race. If you think that the other person's, the other party's going to raise £20 million, well, you're going to want to try and raise 25 million. So there's a sense in which you're going to want to try and outspend them. It's a chicken and egg situation, but the more money we allow people to spend, the more we're going to see it. And crucially as well, we don't have any caps on political donations in the UK. And I think that's what we're remembering.
I was going to ask about that. I mean, you've talked about about the massive increase in the amount of money that's coming into political parties and the concentration of that being in the hands of just a very few donors. And you've mentioned the fact that there's cap on spending at election time. Do you think there should be a cap on how much one individual donor can give?
One way of framing that question, I think, is exactly that. How do we feel about having that amount of concentration of one person being able to effectively buy a lot more access than somebody else? And it's interesting, earlier this year, the government, Philip Roycroft, the former civil servant, senior civil servant, he was commissioned on the back of Nathan Gill, the former reform leader in Wales, who was sentenced to, I think, about 10 years in prison for taking money to repeat pro-Russian talking points in the European Parliament. On the back of that, Keir Starmer announced that they were going to have a kind of an inquiry into foreign interference in British politics. So Philip Roycroft looked into this, and in full disclosure, I spoke to him as part of this process too, and he recommended, and it was taken up, £100,000 cap on donations from Britons who are abroad. That's been accepted, so Parliament, that's going to be part of the representation bill. So we're going to have a cap on people abroad who can vote, and that'll be £100,000. That feels to me like a reasonable principle. I think there's actually a fair principle there. If someone who can vote in a British election but lives abroad, if they can give £100,000, that feels to me like a reasonable principle to be adopted across
but no
our
cap
political
on
system.
donations. But no cap on donations for people who live in this country. What do you think about that?
See, that's what I mean about the principle. I don't think, on two levels, I actually don't necessarily think it's particularly fair. I don't know why we think it's okay for very rich people who live in the UK to have outside influence, but not those who don't live in the UK. And I think my general take is I think we should cap political donations, because otherwise I think we're going to see this arms race get even more extreme. Because we have the evidence in front of us, really. I did a story on Democracy for Sale last year. 75% of reforms funding had come from just 3 people. They're particularly extreme reforms. Concentration of funding is really extreme. But you can see similarities in other parties too. It's not, they're an outlier, but the trend is generally towards this much more concentration. And I think a cap would force parties to kind of move away from that and try and think of other ways of trying to raise money.
I agree with you. I think there should be a cap on political donations, and I think that should be part of a wider package.
So can I ask, whether it's material, Peter, does the person or the party that spends the most money always win the election? And is that because they spend the most money, if it is? Or is it because they raise the most money because people already know they're going to win, or they're in the lead and people like to back a winner?
It's a really good question, and there's quite a bit of academic research on this, both in the US and in the UK. And actually, the research in the US is slightly different to the research in the UK in terms of its findings. The research in the UK actually does suggest that basically more money does equal more political success. There is a kind of causation-correlation question there. Like, successful parties tend to bring in more money. So if you look at the last general election, 2024, one of the reasons why the Conservatives raised the spending limits is because in 2019, Boris Johnson raised so much money they couldn't spend it all. In the short campaign running up to the general election, Boris Johnson raised more than £40 million, which is a huge amount of money, huge record. By the time 2024 rocks up, the Tories are quite clearly not going to do very well. They're going to go out of power. They raise about a tenth of that in the short campaign, in those few weeks leading up to it. They raised more money before the campaign, but there was a huge fall away in donations, frankly, because everyone could see where things were going. So money does tend to flow to those who are going to do well. But at the same time, especially, it's got two things, especially for incumbents, money is very important, but also it has a strange left-right split. Money is more effective on the right than it is on the left. Partly that's because you still, even though Labour has big donors, the concentration of small money, of big money, is always kind of on the right, and that's kind of makes sort of slightly sense. You're going to people who want lower taxes are more likely to be wealthy, are more likely to give money to parties that do that. You see that in the US, you see that in the UK, and you see it in other jurisdictions in which there isn't caps on spending. But by and large, money does make a big difference.
I guess there's a question here as well about when you talk about people funding political parties and then what you get for that funding. Is the problem in your mind, is it the access and the influence, or is it the transparency?
I think what's really striking is just that if you look at the data and the details, actually we're seeing way more money now comes from, we did a story recently on Democracy for Sale about the amount of money that's coming from corporate vehicles, from companies, and that's increased. It's trebled at the last 3 elections. It's now more than the money that comes from unions. But that, for example, that's not money coming from FTSE 500 companies. Not a single one of those is from a FTSE 500 company. They all don't give money to politics anymore since we've had transparency for the last 20 years. So we've had electoral transparency. So big companies don't want to be seen doing that. What companies increasingly are just vehicles for individuals that adds a layer of opacity. So an individual will use a company that they own. They will use, so for example, Frank Hester, the Tory donor who gave out, I think, over £15 million. All of his money, or pretty much all of it, came through a thing called the Phoenix Partnership, which is a company he owns. It's all there in black and white, but it makes it that bit harder for people to see. And so it kind of adds that layer of opacity into the funding process.
So, Peter, we've been talking really about almost the kind of history of how the parties have grown up and what traditional funding looks like. Things have changed massively in the last 15 years in terms of this is all money that we've been talking about that is raised, that goes to a political party, that they then spend on leaflets and adverts and all that sort of stuff. Really kind of analog campaigning. What we've seen in recent years is not just the kind of rise of digital campaigning, but we've also seen the rise of unregulated online stuff, and that it doesn't actually even come from political parties. It can come from other interest groups. It can come from foreign countries. It can come from bot farms. Like, how has that changed UK politics?
It's an absolutely massive change. Even from when I wrote my last book in 2020, this was part of the world. There was some, we knew that these things were happening online. But now it's both much deeper. It's much more extensive. It's much harder to track, and there's much less transparency because the big tech companies, who effectively this all happens on big tech platforms. Like, it happens on the internet. It feels like it happens. It happens in the ether. It happens, in a space that just is kind of beyond party politics, but no one can control. But it's worth remembering these are platforms owned by companies, often big Silicon Valley companies. And the reason I say all that is after 2016, after the Trump election, Facebook was under pressure, and it came out and brought out this thing called the ad library. So if you put political ads on Facebook, you have to, and it's quite a broad definition of politics, you have to give details. You have to say how much you spent, etc. That now is the only, and it's actually got a lot worse, but it's the only part of any bit of transparency really we get about ad spending or how any of this works. But we can see it happening in real time. And it's one of the things, like, I write a lot about political donations, but actually this online part of it is becoming a really big part of it, because there's ways, and I traced this isn't new in many respects. We saw even in 2019 general election, 2016 elections, other times, we have seen these unregulated campaigns start to pop up on the internet. But effectively, it was a bit easier to track 5 or 6 years ago because they were mainly on Facebook and you could see their spending and you could at least start to find them. Now it's really hard to see. The API on Twitter was as an X as Twitter as it was, that was locked down quite a while ago.
Peter, what's the API again?
Oh, sorry. The API is effectively
asking for a friend.
No, you're totally fine. The API is effectively the source code that you can see and that you can interact with. So you can see how things. So there's a lot of internet researchers. So there's a lot of people, a lot of the kind of the work you might have seen in 2016 after the Trump election, showing this kind of swarm of digital disinformation. All of that work is almost impossible to do now. Loads of these academic bodies have effectively had to shutter or find new ways of working because we can't even trace what's happening. But also, Nigel Farage is currently being investigated by the Standards Commission, the Standards Commissioner in Parliament, as we know, in the back of the Clacton by-election. The big blind on that is the £5 million from Christopher Harborne, this big cryptocurrency billionaire who's given, who's now the biggest donor in British political history. He's given over £20 million. But also part of that is a revelation in the Sunday Times that George Cottrell, Posh George, had paid for social media and kind of online campaigners to work for Nigel Farage ahead of the 2024 general election. Farage says no rules were broken. The commissioner's looking into it. But the reason I'm bringing that up is that's really hard to see. So these people, Nigel Farage, what you can see is that Nigel Farage went from being quite popular online, but not particularly interesting, not that interesting, to these slick videos, these reels, a TikTok star. You can actually see Rupert Lowe as well from Restore on X. This huge sense in which you can put a massive amount of firepower behind someone in ways that are really, really hard to see. And I think that's the piece that, like, at the very least, we need to start trying to answer that question. I don't have easy answers to that. I'd love to tell you I did, but this is becoming a huge part, because you can see how the narrative changes due to what's happening on social media. The ability to set a narrative, especially during a general election campaign, is absolutely critical. So money can be spent there. It can be spent. We saw actually some analysis done about the unrest in Belfast during the summer. A lot of that activity, especially the more violent activity, was coming from accounts that weren't in the UK. So it's very clear that it's possible to influence our politics. And actually, the Trump administration in the US has said that they do want to push particular narratives in the UK. So in some respects, the quiet part has already been said out loud, but online, I think, is a space in which it's proliferating in ways that we can't see.
So, just to keep ourselves legally in the right here, it's worth saying that a spokesperson for Reform has said that Mr. Farage has always been clear that this was a personal, unconditional gift and no rules were broken. And that's in relation to the Harborne £5 million donation.
But this is another example, isn't it, what you were talking about, Peter, of the enormous influence tech companies have. Is there any sign that they would be willing to cooperate with regulation to make this more transparent so that people can see actually what's happening here? Or is it another case of where they're going to resist and it's going to have to be done despite them, not with their cooperation?
They will resist, I think it's fair to say. If you look at one of the striking features of not of British politics but American politics over the last 10 years is the extent to which Silicon Valley has become very, very close to the Trump administration and the MAGA movement. We've seen, you saw it at the last inauguration, Mark Zuckerberg from Meta, Jeff Bezos from Amazon, Alex Carr from Palantir is now a big is a Trump donor as well. Obviously, Elon Musk was brought in to run Doge. So that whole connectivity is now really, really strong. And in some respects, it's harder now to do something than it was 5 years ago for that very reason, Harry. I think far from looking to be transparent on this, actually many of the people running tech platforms have their own political agenda that they're pushing.
Do you know what I found really interesting is with what's happening in Iran, there's been a couple of kind of blackouts of the internet there. And then when you see when that happens, there's companies that kind of monitor what goes on in cyberspace. And in my part of the world, there was a big story that blew up that around 4% of pro-Scottish independence sites went down on companies like Twitter and platforms like that. So 4% doesn't sound like much, but we're talking way over 1,000. We're talking over 200 million views of stuff that they put out over the last few years. And I just can't get my head around somebody in Iran wants to talk about what's going on in Govan or Montefieth or something like that. Like, it just seems mad.
I find that so chilling. The idea is that we think we're reading a genuine opinion showing us what people are thinking somewhere in Scotland, and actually it's completely fake and we're being completely deceived. It is quite frightening, that, isn't it? The impact that it can have.
It is. I think it can have a huge electoral impact. I think this is the thing, and we haven't really tested this as a general election, and I have concerns about what that looks like. I think it's, there's what can sometimes feel a bit is that we either have tech companies won't do anything, so what can we do? But there is, if you talk to people at places like Demos and others who've been doing a lot of work on this, epistemic security, thinking about the election process as a kind of a massive security kind of issue, something that we need to be really, really guarded around. I think there's a lot that needs to be done around that. If you talk to experts like I do, they will tell you that there's a real risk there. You can imagine if we had some huge story breaks the night before a general election, by the time the kind of old journalism adage that the lie is halfway around the world before the truth has had the time to put its boots on, that becomes far more significant in a context like that. And I think we've been quite remiss, I think, to not think about that, and not think, frankly, that there is other actors out there that would want to do that, whether it's for political gain in the UK or people internationally. I think we've politics is something that, in the same way that the police don't like to say to get involved with policing donations. I've written about political donations for many years. Very rarely do do questions about donations end up with, they never really end up in anything criminal, and very rarely do they even end up with a regulatory infringement. And it's one of these things because people don't like getting involved. Even our electoral commission really was set up to run elections, really. That's what its job is. And more it's been forced to kind of deal with stuff like misinformation, deal with stuff like political donations, stuff that it's inherently political and brings with it all manner of difficulties. And I think we need, there's a real need to kind of go, okay, right, this stuff is really serious. What are we going to do about it?
Peter, I was a journalist before I was a politician, before I got elected to the Scottish Parliament. And one of the last kind of big political stories I worked on was a huge financial scandal in the Scottish Parliament that required the sort of stepping down of the Labour Party leader, Wendy Alexander, because in her leadership election, she took £950 from a man who was based in Jersey. And she got into trouble for that because he wasn't based as a UK voter. And the reason that her team had taken the money, because obviously she was running an election campaign, somebody was in charge of that, another MSP, was because he was a long-time political donor, but he'd always given from his UK-based company. And it felt like a big thing at the time. Like, the Parliament put a sanction on her, said that she'd done wrong. There was no intent. They could see there was no intent. But because it had been wrong, she fell on her sword and she left as a point of honour because the rules had been broken in their broadest sense. And it just seems tiny now. Like, it seems like we are such a world away from where 950 quid can bring down a political leader because it's across, a tiny stretch of water from the UK to Jersey. And it just seems like the forces now that are sort of surrounding the island and surrounding our politics are so big that we just need to rethink from the very beginning, how do we protect what it is that we value? And if we value our elections, if we value our democracy, if we value how we run ourselves as a nation, we have to start again and look at the big forces, not just the kind of little rules that we've always dealt with in the past.
I think what you're saying, I would very much agree. I'm often struck that, things that would have prompted a resignation, ministerial resignation, whatever, 20 years ago don't now. I think we can all see that. And I think it also shows how kind of insubstantial the old, like it's, we often hear of what Peter Hennessy called the good chaps theory of government. We're all going to be good chaps. That's how we run in Britain. And no one goes too far. We don't break the rules. And, and if you do, you fall on your sword, etc. That to me really feels like it's totally gone out the window. And the kind of like, I'm really struck that almost everything that we have in terms of rules is really conventions. They're not criminal sanctions. And we talk a lot about the Standards Commissioner. These really are not. These are not particularly powerful bodies in terms of what they can actually do. The most they can do is issue a suspension from the House that then requires people locally to sign a petition. It's quite a long process to even get another by-election. Some of these things, but we don't really treat them seriously. I was really struck that Michael Cohen, Donald Trump's fixer, he broke election law in the US and he ended up in prison. In the UK, it's changed, but up until very recently, the maximum fine for breaking election law is £20,000. If you're in a situation where you're taking tens of millions of donations, a £20,000 fine, which is the maximum for breaking the rules, it's, as people said to me at the time, it's just the cost of doing business. And even when you increase the fines are going to have been increased significantly, you can still pay your way out of these things. We don't, I think, treat them with the seriousness that they deserve. And what you end up with, we've ended up at a place, our election laws are really complicated as well. They're really, really complicated. So people do break them inadvertently as well over quite small things. And so you end up at a place where it's quite hard to separate out. So we end up with a lot of scandals. And it kind of goes back to where I started around private donations as well. Because we run on private donations, politicians would always be in the place where they're sitting next to private donors at clubs, at dinners, at all the rest of it, which kind of builds in conflicts of interest into the system, builds in scandal, and actually then builds in lack of trust because people think that, quote unquote, we've all heard this, they're all the same, they're all in it together, they're all doing the same thing. So I think it's quite a destructive circle that we've kind of got ourselves stuck in on this.
I think we've obviously got loads more progress we need to make on this. I think it is encouraging, though, that the changes in the standards regime in the House of Commons means that there's a real fear and a sense of jeopardy amongst MPs about what will happen if they break the rules. And I think that that's why Nigel Farage has reacted so extremely to the fact that a complaint's been made and he's been referred to the Standards Commissioner for an investigation, because as we've seen previously, what can happen at the end of a Standards Commissioner investigation with the Standards and Privileges Committee looking into it and the House voting on it, it can mean that somebody's thrown out of the House of Commons. There has to be a bit of a process of that, because actually you're talking about kicking somebody out who was voted for by the voters. So you have to have a bit of a process. But compared to what the situation used to be in the House of Commons, there is a real sense of jeopardy and fear amongst MPs that if they break the rules, they'll be out on their ear. But we just don't have any of that sense in terms of private donors and tech companies. So perhaps there's a possibility for progress, but there's got to be political will to really get this issue by the scruff of the neck, build a consensus amongst all the parties and get a grip on it.
Peter, thank you so much for joining us, giving us a really big run up there in terms of how we've got to where we are. That's all from us today, but I'll be back on Tuesday with Jess Phillips for an Insider Show. So if you'd like to hear that, the link to subscribe is in the show notes.
And do tell us what you thought of today's episode. If you're an insider, you can access the Members Forum via the link in the show notes. And the burner phone is still in action. That's 07934 200 444.
But for now, goodbye.
Goodbye.